that maybe you could tell us about this thinking of Gregory Bateson, The Hand of Addiction, the book you wrote, and it's not the fingers, it's the relationship, it's the space in between, right?
Yes. Yeah. That was so when I was first introduced to Gregory Bateson was his work Ecology of Mind. And I was in a course with Dr. Hans Scott Meyer, and he started to work with us on these concepts. And when I heard Bateson talk about the human hand, and he said, yeah, if you look at the hand, we typically begin to think it's these five independent, separate, compartmentalized fingers. But if you really look at the functionality of the system, it's all intertwined in a web and a tapestry of interconnectedness, and how they relate to one another becomes very important. So it's the four spaces in between, and that's why I called it the spaces in between. And what I started to do, Patrick, is if you went to any bookstore or you went and you researched addiction, what you would see is different theorists, psychologists, and academics would pick one of these five arenas to look at addiction through, almost like a lens, and they would prioritize it over the others. So I went and looked at the thumb, which I called the biomedical, or the biological, this idea that we have a DNA and we have a neurology and a brain chemistry, and so much of addiction will look at the brain and the areas of the brain that the dopaminergic system, accumbens, how this relates to our reward pathways and addiction and how it shows up in our brain chemistry. So the biological, you could get a lot of people that were like, that's it. We know what addiction is. It's a brain disease and it's biological and it operates in this way. Then you move to the index finger, which I called the psychological. And this is where you would get theorists like Dr. Gabor Mate, who has done beautiful work, and I love all of his work, but he would say, wait a minute, it's the psychological. It has a lot to do with the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, our narrative of self, our personal lived experience, our personal history, whether we've had childhood trauma, what we've been through, how we've housed that. Addiction becomes this psychological component that runs deep. And then I won't flip everybody off, but the middle finger is the sociocultural. And this is Bruce Alexander's work and other amazing practitioners where they went, hey, we got to pay attention to, we have been socio-culturally indoctrinated to participate in continual addiction, whether through consumption. But Bruce Alexander's work went really deep with this from a historical and a lineage perspective, where he looked at a term he called psychosocial disintegration. And this idea that we had, the West had come into Aboriginal Australian cultures, African cultures, Native American cultures, and we had taken their ways of being, ways of relating to themselves, to their communities, and we had basically ripped them and extracted them from their roots and therefore created these addictive tendencies that we see. So the sociocultural was a way to look at it. And then the ring finger is what I call the developmental. And this would be any of the theorists that would look at youth and addiction or young adult addiction. And they would say it has to do with um, a not fully formed prefrontal cortex and executive functioning and youth energy and impulsivity and risk taking, and would just look at everything through a developmental lens. And then finally, the pinky was the spiritual. And this would be work like Stanley Groff's wife, Christina Groff. She wrote an incredible book called The Thirst for Wholeness, looking at all addiction as an attempt to have union or connection with the Most High or God or the divine. Um, and what I wanted to do is I wanted to take Bateson's profound work and go, not only is it all of those, but at the same time, we're the one who made those up. When you go into the institutions and the academic colleges, you see that we separate everything. We have anthropology, we have sociology, we have psychology, we have chemistry, we have biology, and we act as if they are separate from one another. But Bateson's famous quote was the biggest problems in the world lie in the difference between how nature works and how man thinks. Life doesn't operate where it's going, it's anthropology over here, it's psychology over here, and nor do we as this organic plant matter. You can't just study my biochemistry. Ken Wilber talked about it really well. He was like, you could take a brain and you can weigh it, you can measure it, you can look at the neurotransmitters, you can look at the functioning of the brain, and you can never know a single thought or emotion that that person ever felt. It will give you different information in different ways. So I wanted to look at the relationships in between. What is the relationship between the biological processes, the psychological narratives, the socio-cultural that we're immersed in, our development, and the spiritual to take the exploration of addiction to a more nuanced understanding? Because I think everybody's asking, what is addiction? And that question doesn't necessarily interest me. What interests me is, what does addiction do? How does it move? How does it flux and flow? What does the energy of it do? And I also pulled in quite a bit of work from Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, and they've written some seminal text over the years. But French postmodern philosophers, they wrote Anti-Oedipus, and then another work called Capitalism and Schizophrenia. And they look at things, they call it the rhizome, which is a botanical analogy looking at how things grow rhizomatically rather than like a tree-like structure. And the rhizome is this underground stem of roots that if you break off at one end, it forms and you can't really trace it and you can't map it, and it moves and it flows and it ebbs and it fluxes. And I think in many ways, addiction is a rhizome. And when we try and pin it down, it will kind of reveal to us its multiplicity.
Yeah, we call it the whack-a-mole.
Yeah, there you go. 100%. Just as soon as you got it, you're like, you know what? I figured out my addiction. It's this. And if I
Yeah,
can control this aspect, and you just start to see, it moves. And that's where I say, Patrick, I'm very grateful for my addiction, if we want to call it that, and more of my relationship with the addictive aspects of myself and culture, as taking me to learn to understand about myself more.